The history of life on Earth has been known in outline for many years, but there were a number of tantalizing gaps in it, particularly in the history of animals with backbones. When, for example, did the first signs of a backbone appear? Long before dinosaurs ever appeared, Earth was already a world shaped by violence, instability, and relentless natural selection. This was not a gentle beginning to life, but a hostile planet still cooling from its formation, scarred by constant volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, and shifting continents. Oceans dominated the surface, thick with minerals and heat, while the land was largely barren and unforgiving. Yet, within these harsh conditions, life did not merely survive. It evolved, adapted, and began pushing the limits of size and power far earlier than most people imagine. In this ancient world, there were no dinosaurs, no birds, no mammals, and no familiar ecosystems. Instead, life was experimental. Evolution had no blueprint, only trial and error. Early animals explored body plans that would later vanish forever. Some developed armor thicker than bone, others evolved grasping limbs, spines, crushing jaws, or alien sensory systems. Predators emerged quickly, and once predation existed, size became an advantage. Bigger bodies meant greater reach, stronger attacks, and better protection. This simple rule would drive the rise of terrifying giants millions of years before the first dinosaur egg was ever laid. The atmosphere itself played a crucial role. Oxygen levels fluctuated dramatically across deep time, at moments reaching concentrations far higher than today. This allowed animals to grow larger than modern biology would normally permit. Oceans rich in nutrients fueled massive food webs, supporting predators that dwarfed anything alive in the same environments now. Without advanced vertebrates to challenge them, early giants faced little competition once they reached the top of the food chain. Dominance could last for millions of years. Earth during this era was also a planet of extremes. Temperatures swung violently, sea levels rose and fell, and entire habitats could disappear in a geological instant. Survival favored creatures that were not only large, but adaptable. Gigantism was not just about intimidation. It was about efficiency, endurance, and control over territory. The giants of this world were not accidents of evolution. They were the logical outcome of an environment that rewarded power above all else. This chapter marks the beginning of a forgotten age. An age where monsters ruled without dinosaurs, where oceans hid apex predators older than any reptile, and where the foundations of fearsome life were laid in silence. To understand dinosaurs, one must first understand the giants that came before them. They were not shadows of later creatures. They were the original rulers of Earth. The true turning point in the rise of Earth's earliest giants began with a biological revolution in the oceans, a moment when life shifted from simplicity to complexity at an unprecedented speed. This period transformed the planet's seas into laboratories of evolution, where new body forms appeared rapidly and survival depended on innovation. Before this time, most living things were small, soft-bodied, and slow. Afterward, the oceans became crowded with animals that could see, move with purpose, defend themselves, and kill. This explosion of life did not happen quietly. It reshaped marine ecosystems almost overnight. In geological terms, animals developed hard shells, segmented bodies, and specialized limbs. Eyes evolved, allowing predators to detect movement and prey to sense danger. Once vision entered the equation. Hiding was no longer enough. Animals had to run, fight, or grow defenses. This single change accelerated evolution and pushed species toward extremes, including increased size. Predation was the key driver. The first predators forced prey animals to adapt, and those adaptations triggered counter-adaptations in hunters. Shells became thicker, spines sharper, and movement faster. Predators responded by growing larger, stronger, and more efficient. Size offered clear advantages. A larger animal could overpower smaller prey, resist attacks, and control territory. In nutrient-rich seas, growing big was not a disadvantage, it was a winning strategy. The ocean floor became a complex, layered battlefield. Small organisms fed on algae and bacteria. Mid-sized animals hunted them. Above all of them were the emerging giants, cruising through the water column as living weapons. These apex predators did not need speed alone. They relied on reach, strength, and intimidation. Many early animals had never encountered such threats, making them easy targets. Extinction became common, but it also cleared space for new, even more extreme life forms to evolve. What makes this era especially disturbing is how alien these creatures were. Many early animals do not resemble anything alive today. Their body plans were experimental, sometimes appearing inefficient or monstrous by modern standards. Some had circular mouths lined with teeth. Others had multiple eyes or grasping limbs, unlike any modern joint. Nature was not refining life yet. It was testing possibilities, and size was one of the most successful experiments. These early seas were also stable enough to sustain giants for long periods. Warm temperatures, shallow continental shelves, and abundant food allowed large predators to thrive without collapse. Unlike later eras, there were few competitors capable of challenging them. Once a species reached the top, it often remained there for millions of years. Dominance was not temporary. It was an evolutionary achievement. This chapter represents the moment Earth crossed a threshold. Life stopped being passive and became aggressive. Survival was no longer about endurance alone, but about power. The giants that would soon rule the planet were not sudden accidents. They were the inevitable result of a world where evolution rewarded those that could hunt, dominate, and grow beyond all limits. As the planet moved deeper into the Ordovician period, Earth's oceans transformed into vast, crowded ecosystems unlike anything that had existed before. Sea levels were extremely high, flooding continental margins and creating endless shallow seas rich in nutrients. These warm waters became ideal environments for life to expand, diversify, and grow larger. Food was abundant, space was vast, and evolutionary pressure favored animals that could dominate wide territories rather than hide within them. Marine life flourished at every level. Plankton blooms fed small organisms, which in turn supported increasingly large predators. Reef systems expanded, built by early corals and sponge-like organisms, forming underwater cities that attracted countless species. Within these reefs lived armored animals, shelled creatures, and early relatives of modern mollusks. But above them, in open water, something far more dangerous was emerging. Predators were no longer confined to the sea floor. They began to patrol the water column itself. Size became a decisive advantage in these oceans. Larger animals could travel farther, hunt more efficiently, and consume a wider range of prey. Many species evolved thick shells and heavy armor, but this only encouraged predators to grow even stronger. Crushing strength replaced speed as the ultimate weapon. Once an animal could break armor, it could feed almost without limitation. The seas slowly shifted from balanced ecosystems into hierarchies ruled by a few dominant giants. These giants were not mindless brutes. Their success depended on sensory awareness, coordination, and control of movement in 3 dimensions. Vision improved, allowing predators to track prey at distance. Swimming appendages became more efficient, enabling sustained movement rather than short bursts. Hunting became active and deliberate. Prey animals responded by forming groups, burrowing, or developing more elaborate defenses, yet no defense was perfect. Evolution favored those at the top, and the gap between predator and prey continued to widen. What makes this period especially important is that it marks the first time Earth truly belonged to large animals. Before this, giants were rare and experimental. Now, they were becoming the norm in many environments. Ecosystems stabilized around them. Entire food webs existed to support a handful of massive predators. Extinction events occurred, but life recovered quickly, often returning in even larger forms. The ocean had become a proving ground for gigantism. These seas would remain dominant for tens of millions of years, shaping the future of life itself. The rules established here would echo through all later eras, grow larger, grow stronger, or disappear. Long before dinosaurs claimed the land, the oceans had already taught evolution how to create monsters. Among the earliest true apex predators ever to evolve, one creature stands apart as a symbol of prehistoric terror. Long before dinosaurs, before large reptiles, and before life had even touched land, Anomalocaris ruled the oceans as an unstoppable hunter. In its time, there was nothing comparable. It was not just large for its era, it was overwhelmingly dominant. Built for killing in a world where most animals were slow, soft, and defenseless. Anomalocaris emerged in ancient seas that were still adjusting to the presence of predators. Many animals had evolved armor, but few had evolved ways to escape active pursuit. This creature exploited that weakness. Its body was streamlined for swimming, allowing it to move freely through open water rather than remaining bound to the sea floor. Unlike most early animals, it did not wait for food to come to it. It hunted. Its anatomy was unlike anything seen today. At the front of its body were 2 large, curved, grasping appendages lined with spines. These limbs acted like living traps, snapping shut around prey and pulling it toward a circular mouth lined with hardened plates. Once caught, escape was nearly impossible. This feeding system allowed Anomalocaris to crush armored animals that believed themselves protected. Trilobites, once among the most successful creatures of the seas, became regular prey. Many fossilized trilobites show bite marks and crushed shells, silent evidence of violent encounters that ended in failure. Vision was one of Anomalocaris's greatest advantages. Its eyes were large, complex, and capable of detecting movement with remarkable precision. In a world where most animals could barely sense light and shadow, this gave it an overwhelming edge. It could spot prey from a distance, track movement, and time its attacks with deadly accuracy. This was not a primitive ambush predator. It was an active hunter that selected targets and pursued them. Size amplified every one of these advantages. While many animals of its time were only a few centimeters long, Anomalocaris reached lengths that made it appear monstrous by comparison. In the Cambrian seas, size alone was enough to inspire fear. Prey animals had no evolutionary memory of such threats. There had been no time to adapt. When Anomalocaris appeared, it rewrote the rules of survival. Its swimming method was also advanced for its time. A series of overlapping flaps ran along its sides, allowing it to move smoothly and efficiently through water. This design enabled both speed and maneuverability, allowing it to adjust direction mid-pursuit. It could rise through the water column, descend toward the seafloor, and patrol large territories. No area of the shallow seas was truly safe. What made Anomalocaris especially terrifying was not just its power, but the imbalance it created within ecosystems. When a predator emerges with no natural rivals, it reshapes the entire environment. Prey populations decline or adapt rapidly. Some species retreat into burrows. Others develop thicker shells or spines. Some disappear entirely. Anomalocaris became a force of selection, deciding which traits survived and which failed. Entire evolutionary paths ended because they could not withstand its attacks. Yet even dominance comes with limits. Anomalocaris was highly specialized. Its feeding method worked best on certain prey sizes and shell types. As ecosystems continued to evolve, some animals became too small, too agile, or too well defended. Others diversified in ways that reduced vulnerability. The arms race continued, and while Anomalocaris remained dominant for millions of years, it was not immortal. Its eventual disappearance did not come from a single catastrophe, but from gradual change. Oceans cooled and warmed. Sea levels shifted. New predators emerged with different strategies. Early vertebrates began to appear, introducing jaws, internal skeletons, and new forms of movement. The world that Anomalocaris once ruled began to change beyond recognition. Still, its legacy endured. Anomalocaris proved that large active predators could exist and thrive. It showed evolution that intelligence, vision, and mobility combined with size could create absolute dominance. Every giant predator that came after, from armored fish to massive reptiles, followed principles first demonstrated by this ancient hunter. This chapter represents the first true reign of terror in Earth's history, not driven by dinosaurs, not shaped by mammals, but ruled by a creature that existed in a world still learning what fear meant. Anomalocaris was not a prototype. It was a perfected predator for its time, and in those ancient seas, nothing escaped its shadow. As Anomalocaris faded into deep time, Earth did not become safer. Instead, it entered a new phase where life grew even more aggressive, resilient, and massive. During the Silurian period, the planet underwent profound environmental changes that reshaped ecosystems across the globe. Seas stabilized after earlier extinctions, oxygen levels slowly increased, and life responded by expanding in both diversity and size. This was the age when arthropods truly began their rise toward dominance, setting the stage for some of the most terrifying giants to ever exist. The Silurian world was defined by shallow coastal seas, reef systems, and newly emerging shorelines. Continents were still clustered closer together, creating warm, nutrient-rich waters ideal for marine life. Coral-like organisms, built extensive reefs that became centers of biological activity. Within and around these reefs lived an explosion of arthropods, animals with segmented bodies, jointed limbs, and hard exoskeletons. Their design was efficient, adaptable, and incredibly successful. It allowed them to exploit nearly every available niche. Arthropods had several advantages that made them evolutionary champions. Their exoskeletons provided protection against predators while also offering structural support that allowed growth in size. Jointed limbs gave them precise control over movement, whether crawling, swimming, or grasping prey. Unlike soft-bodied animals, arthropods could evolve specialized appendages for hunting, defense, and sensory detection. This modular body plan meant evolution could modify one part without compromising the whole, leading to rapid innovation. As oxygen levels increased, a crucial biological limitation began to loosen. Arthropods breathed through passive systems rather than lungs, meaning higher oxygen concentrations allowed their bodies to grow larger while still functioning efficiently. This environmental shift unlocked the potential for gigantism. Species that had once been small scavengers began to grow into dominant predators. Others evolved into heavily armored forms that could resist attack and control territory. The Silurian seas became increasingly dangerous. Predation intensified and food webs grew more complex. Early jawless fish appeared, but they were not yet the rulers of the oceans. Arthropods still held the advantage. Many species occupied the role of top predator, hunting smaller arthropods, fish, and soft-bodied animals with ruthless efficiency. These predators did not rely on speed alone. They used ambush tactics, crushing force, and overwhelming numbers. One of the most important developments of this period was the gradual expansion of life toward the edges of land. While true land animals were still rare, arthropods began exploring coastal environments, tidal zones, and shallow waters that were periodically exposed to air. This transition required resilience. Changing salinity, temperature swings, and exposure to air were all deadly risks, yet arthropods adapted. Their exoskeletons prevented dehydration, and their segmented bodies allowed flexibility in movement across uneven surfaces. This slow push toward land marked a turning point. It introduced a new frontier, free from competition by large predators. For the first time, giant arthropods had the opportunity to expand beyond the ocean. The world above the waves was harsh, but it was also empty. Plants had begun colonizing land, stabilizing soil, and creating primitive ecosystems. Where plants grew, food followed. Where food existed, predators were never far behind. Arthropods responded by becoming even more specialized. Some evolved stronger limbs for crawling over solid ground. Others developed sensory structures capable of detecting vibration and chemical signals in air. These adaptations laid the groundwork for future terrestrial giants. Although the largest monsters of land would appear later, their evolutionary foundations were built here in the Silurian. In the oceans, competition continued to escalate. Predators became more aggressive, and prey animals responded with thicker armor, sharper spines, and defensive behaviors. This arms race pushed both sides toward extremes. Size was not merely an advantage. It became a necessity. Smaller animals were eaten or driven into marginal habitats. Larger animals controlled resources and dictated the structure of entire ecosystems. Extinction events still occurred, but recovery was rapid. Each reset allowed life to re-emerge in new, often larger forms. Evolution was learning a powerful lesson. When environments stabilize and oxygen is abundant, life tends to grow bigger. The Silurian was one of the first times this pattern became clear on a global scale. By the end of this period, Earth was no longer a planet dominated solely by simple marine life. It had become a world of expanding complexity, rising oxygen, and escalating biological warfare. Arthropods were no longer background creatures. They were architects of ecosystems, shaping both sea and shore through their dominance. Their success would echo forward into the next eras, where size and terror would reach levels never seen before. This chapter represents the quiet build-up before true monstrosity. The Silurian did not yet host the largest giants, but it created the conditions that made them possible. Oxygen-rich air, resilient body plans, and empty ecological space combined into a perfect storm. The age of arthropods had begun, and Earth would never be the same again. As the world moved forward, the oceans gave rise to predators so efficient and so dominant that they would remain unmatched for tens of millions of years. Among them were the giant sea scorpions, known scientifically as Eurypterids. These creatures were not insects, not true scorpions, and not fish. They were arthropod hunters, engineered by evolution to dominate shallow seas, estuaries, and coastal waters with ruthless precision. Eurypterids appeared after earlier marine predators had already established the value of size and aggression. But they refined these traits into something far more terrifying. Their bodies were segmented and armored, providing both flexibility and protection. At the front were grasping limbs armed with spines, designed to seize prey and hold it immobile. Behind these were powerful swimming paddles that allowed them to move quickly through water, ambush victims, or patrol vast territories. Some species were small, but others grew to extraordinary lengths, rivaling modern crocodiles in size. What made giant sea scorpions especially deadly was their adaptability. They were not confined to a single environment. Many species thrived in shallow marine waters, while others moved freely between oceans, rivers, and coastal lagoons. Some even tolerated low-oxygen environments where other predators could not survive. This flexibility allowed Eurypterids to spread across the planet and dominate multiple ecosystems at once. Their hunting strategy relied on overwhelming control, rather than chasing prey over long distances. Giant sea scorpions often ambushed from below or from cover. Once their grasping limbs closed, escape was unlikely. Prey animals included early fish, smaller arthropods, and soft-bodied marine organisms. Even armored animals were not safe. Eurypterids possessed enough strength to crack shells or tear exposed limbs apart in many fossil beds. Damaged fish and broken exoskeletons tell the story of violent encounters that ended abruptly. Size played a critical role in their success. The largest Eurypterids reached lengths exceeding 2 meters, making them among the largest arthropods to ever exist. In their time, nothing else in the water matched them. Early fish lacked the speed and coordination to escape. Other arthropods were simply overpowered. Once a giant sea scorpion claimed an area, it effectively controlled the food supply within it. Vision and sensory awareness further enhanced their dominance. Eurypterids possessed compound eyes capable of detecting movement and contrast in murky water. They were sensitive to vibration, allowing them to sense prey even when visibility was poor. This meant that hiding offered little protection. Movement itself became dangerous. Entire ecosystems adjusted around the presence of these predators, with prey animals adopting defensive behaviors or retreating into environments less favorable to hunting. One of the most fearsome members of this group was Jaekelopterus, a species that reached truly monstrous proportions. Estimates suggest it was capable of preying on early armored fish with ease. Its claws were large enough to grip and crush, and its body mass allowed it to dominate any habitat it entered. In shallow waters, encountering such a creature would have meant instant death. Giant sea scorpions were also among the first predators to exploit the boundary between water and land. Many species could survive brief exposure to air, allowing them to move through tidal zones and hunt in environments where prey had few escape options. This ability expanded their reach dramatically. River mouths, lagoons, and coastal flats became hunting grounds. Prey animals attempting to escape marine predators by moving into shallow water often found themselves facing something even worse. Their success reshaped the evolutionary path of early fish. Under constant pressure from eurypterids, fish evolved stronger armor, better swimming ability, and eventually jaws capable of fighting back. This arms race would later give rise to new apex predators, but during the reign of giant sea scorpions, fish were largely victims rather than rivals. Despite their dominance, eurypterids were not immune to change. Environmental shifts gradually altered the world they ruled. Oxygen levels fluctuated. Sea levels rose and fell. Habitats fragmented. As fish evolved faster swimming, better coordination, and more powerful jaws, the balance of power began to shift. Predators that relied on exoskeletons and external limbs faced new challenges against vertebrates with internal skeletons and flexible movement. Competition increased, and some eurypterid species declined, others adapted, shrinking in size or retreating into specialized environments. But the age of true giants was slowly coming to an end. The seas were no longer empty of rivals. A new kind of predator was emerging, one that would eventually take control of both water and land. Yet for millions of years, giant sea scorpions were unrivaled. They were living weapons, perfectly suited to a world where size, strength, and fear determined survival. Their reign stands as one of the most extreme examples of arthropod dominance in Earth's history. Long before dinosaurs inspired terror, these creatures ruled silently beneath ancient waves, turning shallow seas into lethal traps where few animals survived an encounter. This chapter marks the height of arthropod power. The giants of this era did not roar or stomp across land. They struck from the water, unseen and unstoppable. And in their time, the oceans belonged entirely to them. As Earth entered the Devonian period, the balance of power in the oceans began to shift in a dramatic and irreversible way. This era is often called the Age of Fishes, but that description understates its brutality. The Devonian seas were not peaceful nurseries of life. They were arenas of constant conflict, where armor thickened, jaws strengthened, and predators reached levels of lethality never seen before. For the first time, vertebrates began to challenge and eventually surpass the great arthropod hunters that had ruled earlier oceans. The Devonian world was warm and rich in nutrients. Continents continued drifting, creating long coastlines and shallow seas that supported enormous marine ecosystems. Coral reefs expanded into complex structures, providing shelter for smaller animals and hunting grounds for predators. Rivers carried nutrients from land into the oceans, fueling plankton blooms and sustaining vast food webs. This abundance allowed life to grow not only more diverse, but far larger. Early fish had existed before, but during this period they underwent explosive diversification. Jawless fish, once dominant, were quickly overshadowed by new forms with jaws, paired fins, and improved swimming ability. Jaws changed everything. They allowed predators to grasp, tear, and crush prey rather than simply filter or suction feed. Once jaws appeared, the arms race escalated rapidly. Predators grew larger. Prey developed thicker armor. Speed, maneuverability, and bite force became decisive traits. Armored fish were among the most striking creatures of this time. Their bodies were encased in heavy, bony plates that acted like natural tanks. These fish were slow compared to later forms, but their armor made them nearly invulnerable to many attacks. Arthropod predators that relied on grasping limbs found these defenses increasingly difficult to overcome. For the first time, the long dominance of giant arthropods faced a serious challenge. Predatory fish responded by growing stronger jaws and more powerful bodies. Some developed sharp teeth, while others evolved bone plates that functioned like living shears. Bite force increased dramatically. Predators no longer needed speed alone. They could ambush, clamp down, and end a fight instantly. The ocean became a place where encounters were brief and decisive. Escape was rare. The Devonian also saw major improvements in mobility. Paired fins allowed fish to turn quickly, stabilize their bodies, and pursue prey with precision. Tails became more powerful, enabling sustained swimming over long distances. Unlike earlier predators, these fish could chase prey across open water rather than relying solely on ambush. This changed the structure of ecosystems. No region of the ocean was truly safe anymore. As fish grew more capable, they began to occupy roles once held by arthropods. Eurypterids still existed, but they were no longer uncontested rulers. In many environments, fish became the dominant predators. This competition pushed both groups toward extremes. Arthropods grew larger and more heavily armored. Fish evolved even stronger jaws and better coordination. The Devonian seas were defined by this escalating biological warfare. One of the most significant developments of this era was the emergence of early sharks and ray-like fish. These animals had flexible skeletons made of cartilage rather than bone. This reduced weight while maintaining strength, allowing for faster movement and greater endurance. Combined with sharp teeth and efficient swimming, these traits made them formidable hunters. They represented a new evolutionary direction, one that would eventually dominate marine environments for hundreds of millions of years. The presence of so many large predators had profound effects on prey species. Smaller fish began schooling as a defense strategy. Others evolved spines, toxins, or camouflage. Some retreated into reefs or murky waters where visibility was low. Still, predation remained intense. Death was constant, and survival required constant adaptation. The Devonian oceans were among the most dangerous environments life had ever produced. This period also laid the groundwork for a revolution beyond the sea. Some fish developed strong fins capable of bearing weight. Others evolved lungs, or lung-like organs, that allowed them to survive in low-oxygen waters. These adaptations were responses to harsh conditions, such as drying pools and fluctuating oxygen levels. Yet they also opened the door to something unprecedented. Life was preparing to leave the water. Giant predators played a crucial role in this transition. Intense pressure in marine environments pushed some species toward new habitats. Shallow waters, river systems, and floodplains became refuges from relentless predation. In these marginal environments, new adaptations were rewarded. Fins slowly transformed into limbs, and bodies became more robust. The first steps toward land were taken not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The Devonian was also marked by ecological instability. Massive reef systems collapsed toward the end of the period, likely due to climate changes and oxygen depletion. These events triggered extinctions that wiped out many species, including some of the largest armored fish. Yet even in collapse, evolution advanced. New predators filled empty niches, often emerging larger and more efficient than those before them. What makes this era especially significant is that it represents a true turning point. Before the Devonian, arthropods dominated the seas. Afterward, vertebrates would never relinquish control. Internal skeletons, powerful jaws, and advanced sensory systems proved more adaptable than exoskeletons and external limbs. The giants of the ocean were changing, not disappearing, but transforming into something more advanced and more dangerous. This chapter captures the moment when the oceans became the domain of jawed predators. It was a time when armor met crushing force, when speed met ambush, and when survival depended on constant innovation. The age of fishes was not a peaceful chapter in Earth's history. It was a crucible that forged the next generation of giants, setting the stage for even more terrifying predators yet to come. Among all the predators that emerged during the Devonian, one name stands above the rest as a symbol of raw power and evolutionary brutality. Dunkleosteus was not simply a large fish. It was a living weapon, built to dominate an ocean already filled with danger. In a world where armor was common and survival depended on strength, this creature represented the ultimate answer. It did not need sharp teeth, speed alone, or ambush tactics. It relied on crushing force so extreme that few animals in Earth's history have ever matched it. Dunkleosteus belonged to a group of armored fish known as placoderms, animals encased in thick bony plates that protected their heads and upper bodies. While many placoderms were slow and heavily defended, Dunkleosteus took this design and pushed it to an extreme. Its head and jaw region were covered in massive interlocking plates of bone that formed a natural helmet. These plates were not just defensive, they were offensive tools, engineered by evolution to deliver devastating bites. Instead of teeth, Dunkleosteus possessed sharpened bony edges that acted like self-sharpening blades. When its jaws closed, these plates slid past one another with incredible precision, slicing and crushing anything caught between them. The force generated by this mechanism was immense. Estimates suggest that Dunkleosteus had one of the strongest bite forces of any animal to ever live, rivaling or exceeding that of modern apex predators in the Devonian seas. No armor was truly safe from such power. Its body size amplified this threat. Dunkleosteus grew to lengths that made it a giant, even by Devonian standards. Surrounded by other large predators, it still stood apart. Its sheer mass allowed it to overpower prey with ease. Smaller fish, arthropods, and even other armored placoderms were all potential targets. Fossil evidence suggests that Dunkleosteus was not selective. It hunted whatever it could catch and crush. Mobility played a key role in its success. Unlike earlier armored fish, Dunkleosteus was not slow and clumsy. It had a streamlined body behind its heavy head armor, allowing it to move efficiently through water. Powerful tail movements provided bursts of speed when attacking. While it may not have been built for long-distance chases, it did not need to be. A single successful strike was often enough. Its hunting strategy likely combined ambush and intimidation. In murky Devonian waters, visibility was limited. Dunkleosteus could remain partially concealed, its armored head blending into the dark. When prey came within range, the attack would be sudden and catastrophic. The snap of its jaws would leave little chance of escape. Even animals that survived the initial bite were often fatally injured. One of the most disturbing aspects of Dunkleosteus behavior is evidence of cannibalism. Fossil remains show placoderm, armor-bearing bite marks that match Dunkleosteus' jaw structures. This suggests that it did not hesitate to attack its own kind. In an ecosystem ruled by scarcity and competition, size and power were the only guarantees of survival. Dominance was absolute, even over rivals of the same species. The presence of such a predator reshaped Devonian ecosystems. Prey species were forced to adapt or vanish. Some developed thicker armor, only to be crushed anyway. Others evolved speed and agility, trying to avoid contact entirely. Some retreated into complex reef systems, where maneuverability mattered more than size, yet no strategy was foolproof. Dunkleosteus occupied the very top of the food chain, and its influence extended through every level beneath it. This predator also represented a major evolutionary milestone. It demonstrated the effectiveness of jaws, not just as tools for feeding, but as instruments of domination. Earlier predators relied on grasping limbs or suction feeding. Dunkleosteus showed that crushing power could end an encounter instantly. This lesson would be learned again and again throughout evolutionary history, from reptiles to mammals. Yet even this armored nightmare was not invincible. The same specialization that made Dunkleosteus so deadly also made it vulnerable to environmental change. Toward the end of the Devonian, global conditions began to shift. Oxygen levels fluctuated, sea levels changed, and reef systems collapsed. These changes disrupted food webs and reduced available habitats. Large, specialized predators struggled to adapt. As new fish lineages evolved, some developed lighter skeletons, faster movement, and more flexible hunting strategies. Sharks and other cartilaginous fish began to rise, able to survive in a wider range of conditions compared to them. Heavily armored placoderms were less adaptable. Their protection came at a cost. Energy demands were high and reproduction was slower. Eventually, Dunkleosteus and its relatives disappeared entirely. Their extinction marked the end of an era, but not the end of giant predators. Instead, it cleared the way for new forms to take over. The ocean did not become less dangerous. It became different. Jaws remained, size remained, and fear remained. Only the shape of the monster changed. This chapter stands as a reminder that dinosaurs were not the first animals to inspire awe and terror long before them. The seas were ruled by creatures capable of crushing bone with a single bite. Dunkleosteus was not a stepping stone. It was a peak, a predator so perfectly adapted to its time that it redefined what dominance meant. And for millions of years, in the dark waters of the Devonian, it was death itself given form. While the oceans were locked in an arms race of armor and crushing jaws, a quieter but far more revolutionary transformation was unfolding at their edges. Life was beginning to crawl onto land. This was not a bold invasion driven by opportunity, but a desperate response to pressure. The seas had become too dangerous, too crowded, and too unforgiving. For some animals, survival no longer lay in becoming bigger or stronger in water, but in escaping it altogether. The shoreline of the ancient world was a harsh and unstable place. Tides rose and fell dramatically. Shallow pools warmed quickly under the sun and dried without warning. Oxygen levels in stagnant waters dropped rapidly, suffocating fish trapped within them. For most marine animals, these conditions were lethal, but for a few, they became a proving ground. Those that could tolerate brief exposure to air, withstand dehydration, or move between pools gained a powerful advantage. Plants had already made the first move onto land. Simple vascular plants spread across floodplains and riverbanks, stabilizing soil and trapping moisture. Their roots slowed erosion, and their decaying matter enriched the ground. Where plants grew, insects and arthropods followed, feeding on stems, spores, and detritus. This created the first primitive terrestrial food webs. Land was no longer empty. It was becoming a source of energy. Certain fish were uniquely prepared to exploit this new world. Some had developed lungs, or lung-like organs, that allowed them to breathe air when oxygen levels in water dropped. Others had strong, muscular fins, capable of supporting part of their body weight. These traits did not evolve for walking. They evolved for survival in hostile waters. Yet they provided the foundation for one of the greatest transitions in Earth's history. As these fish ventured into shallow, plant-filled waters, their fins began to change. Bones within the fins became thicker and more robust, allowing greater control and leverage. Muscles strengthened to support movement against gravity, heads flattened, eyes shifted upward, and neck mobility increased. These changes allowed animals to lift their heads above water, breathe air more efficiently, and scan their surroundings. Step by step, fins began to resemble limbs. The first animals to exploit land were not fully terrestrial. They did not roam far from water. Instead, they moved between environments, hunting in shallow pools, resting on damp ground, and retreating to water to reproduce. These early pioneers were amphibian in nature, tied to moisture and vulnerable to drying out. Yet, even this limited use of land offered enormous advantages. On land, there were no large vertebrate predators. Arthropods were present, but they were prey rather than threats to large animals. Food was abundant and competition was low. Insects and smaller invertebrates had no defenses against vertebrate hunters. An animal that could briefly leave the water could feed freely, then return to safety. This ecological imbalance rewarded any creature capable of exploiting both worlds. The atmosphere itself played a critical role. Oxygen levels were rising, making air breathing increasingly efficient. This allowed larger body sizes to be supported outside water, where buoyancy no longer reduced weight. Animals had to contend with gravity for the first time, forcing major changes in skeleton structure. Spines strengthened, ribs expanded to protect organs. Limb joints became more complex, capable of bearing weight and enabling forward movement. Movement on land was awkward and exhausting at first. Early tetrapods likely dragged their bodies, using limbs to push rather than walk. Yet even this crude locomotion was enough. Speed was not required. There were no fast predators to escape, no rivals to chase them down. Simply being able to move from one pool to another, or from water to vegetation, was enough to survive and reproduce. This transition did not happen quickly. It unfolded over millions of years, with countless failed experiments. Many species ventured onto land only to vanish. Others survived, but never fully adapted. Yet a few lineages succeeded, refining their bodies generation by generation. Limbs grew stronger, digits formed, lungs became more efficient. Skin adapted to reduce water loss while still allowing gas exchange. As these early land animals grew larger, new challenges emerged. Without water to support their weight, size became a liability. Only animals with strong limbs and reinforced skeletons could grow beyond a certain point. This slowed the rise of true giants on land, but it did not stop it. As plants spread and ecosystems stabilized, land began to support increasingly large animals. The presence of vertebrate predators on land also changed the behavior of arthropods. Insects grew larger in response to abundant oxygen and lack of aerial predators. Giant insects filled the forests, some reaching sizes unimaginable today. For early amphibian predators, this was a feast. Large, slow-moving prey required little effort to capture. Energy intake increased, supporting larger body sizes and more active lifestyles. Yet land was not without danger. Exposure to sunlight increased the risk of dehydration. Temperature swings were more extreme than in water. Reproduction remained tied to moisture, limiting how far animals could stray from rivers and swamps. These constraints shaped early terrestrial ecosystems into dense, humid environments where water was always nearby. Predation pressure soon followed. As more vertebrates moved onto land, competition increased. Some species specialized as ambush predators, lying in wait near water sources. Others became active hunters, using their limbs to stalk prey through vegetation. Teeth diversified, jaws strengthened, and senses adapted to air rather than water. Smell and hearing became more important, while vision adjusted to new light conditions. This was the beginning of a new kind of gigantism, no longer driven solely by oxygen-rich seas. Size on land now depended on structural strength and energy efficiency. Animals that could support their weight and regulate their body functions thrived. Those that could not were confined to smaller sizes or forced back into water. The consequences of this transition were enormous. Once vertebrates established themselves on land, they would never fully relinquish it. Every major land animal that followed traces its ancestry back to these early pioneers. Reptiles, dinosaurs, mammals, and eventually humans all inherited bodies shaped by this moment. Limbs, lungs, necks, and weight-bearing spines all emerged here, forged by necessity rather than design. This chapter marks the moment when Earth gained a second arena of life. The oceans remained dangerous, ruled by giants with crushing jaws. But now the land was awakening. Quiet at first, humid and green, it became a refuge for those willing to risk the unknown. The monsters of the future would not rise only from the sea. They would rise from mud, plants, and shallow water, carrying the legacy of ancient oceans into a new world. Life did not conquer land in a single leap. It crept, dragged, and struggled forward. But once it did, the course of Earth's history changed forever. As Earth entered the Carboniferous Period, the planet transformed into a world that would seem almost impossible today. Vast swamp forests stretched across continents, dense with towering plants, tangled roots, and shallow waters that never fully dried. These environments were humid, dark, and heavy with life. But the most important change was invisible. The air itself had become different. Oxygen levels rose to extraordinary heights, far above anything modern animals experience. This single factor would unlock one of the most extreme episodes of gigantism in Earth's history. Oxygen is a biological fuel. It powers metabolism, movement, and growth. During the Carboniferous, oxygen concentrations reached levels estimated to be around 35%, compared to about 21% today. This created conditions where animals that relied on passive breathing systems could grow far larger than normal. No group benefited more from this than arthropods. Insects and their relatives do not breathe using lungs. Instead, oxygen diffuses directly into their bodies through networks of tubes. Under normal conditions, this limits their size. In the Carboniferous, that limitation nearly vanished. The swamp forests themselves played a central role in this transformation. Massive plants absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen at unprecedented rates. Fallen plant material accumulated in waterlogged environments where it did not fully decay, eventually forming coal. This process locked carbon away and allowed oxygen to continue building in the atmosphere. The result was a positive feedback loop. More plants created more oxygen, which allowed animals to grow larger, which in turn shaped the ecosystems around them. The land was now alive with giant arthropods. Insects grew to sizes that would trigger fear instantly in any modern observer. Millipedes stretched longer than human bodies. Spiders and scorpions reached proportions that made them dominant predators rather than minor threats. The skies themselves became dangerous as enormous flying insects took to the air, exploiting the dense oxygen-rich atmosphere to support wingspans that would otherwise be impossible. Movement in this world felt different. Thicker air provided greater lift, making flight easier and more efficient. Insects did not need rapid wing beats to stay airborne. They could glide, maneuver, and hover with minimal effort. Predators could patrol wide areas, scanning forests and wetlands for prey. Escape became difficult. Once spotted, a victim had few options. On the ground, the forests were labyrinths of fallen trunks, roots, and shallow pools. Visibility was low. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. This environment favored ambush predators. Giant arthropods waited motionless, relying on vibration and chemical signals rather than sight. When prey approached, the attack was sudden and overwhelming. Size alone was often enough to subdue victims. Early amphibians shared this world, moving between water and land in search of food. While they were among the largest vertebrates of their time, they were not the dominant predators. Arthropods still held that role in many environments. Their exoskeletons provided protection, and their sheer size made them formidable opponents. An encounter between an early amphibian and a giant arthropod could easily end in death for either, depending on circumstances. Predation pressure increased across all levels of the ecosystem. Smaller insects evolved camouflage, burrowing behaviors, or nocturnal lifestyles to avoid detection. Others developed chemical defenses, or spines. Prey animals that failed to adapt disappeared quickly. Extinction was constant, but it was localized and rapid. New species evolved just as quickly, filling empty niches with even more extreme forms. This era also changed the relationship between fire and life. High oxygen levels made the environment highly flammable. Lightning strikes could ignite massive wildfires that swept through forests with terrifying speed. These fires reshaped landscapes, clearing vegetation and creating new open habitats. While destructive, they also promoted diversity by preventing any single plant community from dominating indefinitely. Giant insects had to adapt to this volatile world. Some species became strong flyers, capable of escaping fires and recolonizing burned areas. Others retreated into water or underground refuges. Those that survived fires often found themselves in environments with fewer competitors and abundant resources. Once again, size provided an advantage. Larger animals could travel farther and exploit new territory more effectively. Despite their dominance, Carboniferous giants were still constrained by their biology. Exoskeletons required molting, a vulnerable process where animals temporarily lost their protection. For massive arthropods, molting was especially dangerous. Failure meant death. Predation pressure during these moments was intense, favoring species that could molt quickly or hide effectively. Reproduction also played a role in limiting size. Larger arthropods required more resources to reach maturity. Environments had to remain stable long enough to support their growth. In regions where conditions fluctuated too rapidly, smaller species had the advantage. This balance kept ecosystems diverse, preventing a single giant species from completely monopolizing resources. Toward the later stages of the Carboniferous, subtle changes began to undermine this world of giants. Climate patterns shifted. Some regions became drier. Swamp forests fragmented. Oxygen levels began to fluctuate rather than steadily increase. These changes placed new stresses on large arthropods. Habitats that once supported enormous bodies became less reliable. Vertebrates, meanwhile, continued to adapt. Early reptiles evolved tougher skin and reproductive strategies less dependent on water. They could venture farther from swamps and survive in drier environments. While still small, they represented a future threat. Internal skeletons, efficient lungs, and more controlled growth gave them long-term advantages over arthropods. The Carboniferous stands as a reminder that gigantism is not just a matter of evolution, but of environment. When conditions align, life can grow to astonishing extremes, but those extremes are fragile. They depend on stability, abundance, and balance. Once those conditions shift, giants become liabilities rather than advantages. This chapter captures the peak of terrestrial arthropod dominance. Never before or since have insects ruled the land at such scale. Forests crawled, flew, and hunted with creatures that seemed closer to nightmares than animals. Long before dinosaurs thundered across the earth, the land already belonged to monsters. And in the thick, oxygen-heavy air of the Carboniferous, they thrived beyond imagination. Above the steaming forests of the Carboniferous, a new kind of terror ruled the air. While giant arthropods dominated the ground and early amphibians hunted the swamps, the skies themselves became hunting grounds. This was the age of giant flying insects, and none embodied this era more completely than the enormous dragonfly-like predators that patrolled the humid atmosphere. Flight, combined with extreme oxygen levels, produced creatures that turned the air into a lethal dimension. The Carboniferous sky was thick and heavy, rich in oxygen and moisture. This made flight far easier than it is today. Wings generated more lift, and muscles worked with greater efficiency. Insects that had already mastered flight suddenly found themselves freed from many of the physical limits that constrain modern species. Wings grew larger, bodies became heavier, and flight endurance increased. The result was an ecosystem where aerial predators could grow to astonishing sizes and remain agile. Giant dragonfly-like insects were among the most dominant animals of this world. With wingspans reaching lengths comparable to modern birds, they were not fragile flyers. They were powerful, fast, and precise. Their wings beat slowly but forcefully, allowing them to glide between trees, hover above clearings, and dive with lethal accuracy. The air itself supported them, carrying their weight effortlessly. Their vision was one of their greatest weapons. Large compound eyes gave them nearly panoramic awareness, allowing them to detect movement across wide areas. Prey had little chance of approaching unnoticed. Even subtle vibrations or flashes of motion were enough to trigger pursuit. Once a target was identified, escape was unlikely. These predators could accelerate rapidly, closing distance in moments. Their hunting strategy relied on speed and surprise. Flying low over swampy ground or between towering plants, they scanned for movement below. Early amphibians, smaller insects, and even other flying arthropods were all potential prey. A sudden dive, a snap of powerful mandibles, and the hunt was over. There was no prolonged struggle. These predators were built for efficiency. What made these aerial hunters especially terrifying was their ability to strike across ecosystems. Ground-dwelling animals were no longer safe simply because they stayed out of water. Danger could arrive from above at any moment. This forced prey species to adapt in new ways. Camouflage became more important. Remaining motionless was often the only defense. Some animals shifted activity patterns, becoming nocturnal to avoid daylight hunters. The presence of dominant aerial predators also reshaped insect communities. Competition in the air was intense. Smaller flying insects faced constant pressure, driving rapid evolution. Wings became more maneuverable, flight paths became erratic, some species abandoned flight entirely, retreating into dense vegetation or underground habitats where aerial hunters could not follow. For ground predators, these flying giants were both rivals and threats. A large amphibian moving through shallow water risked being spotted from above. Even giant arthropods were vulnerable during molting or when exposed in open areas. The sky added a new layer of complexity to survival. Ecosystems became fully three-dimensional, with danger coming from land, water, and air. The dominance of flying insects was closely tied to oxygen levels. Flight is energetically demanding, especially for large animals. The high oxygen concentration of the Carboniferous made sustained flight possible at sizes that would later become impossible. Muscles recovered faster, and diffusion-based respiration could meet the demands of flight. This allowed insects to grow far beyond modern limits without collapsing under their own metabolic needs. But flight also imposed constraints. wings were fragile, and damage could be fatal. Collisions with vegetation, predators, or environmental hazards posed constant risks. Storms were especially dangerous. Powerful winds could throw flying insects into obstacles or carry them far from suitable habitats. Survival favored not only size and strength, but control and precision. Reproduction in these giants required stable environments. Eggs were often laid near water or within protected plant structures. Larvae lived in aquatic or semi-aquatic habitats, where they were themselves predators. From the earliest stages of life, these animals were hunters. Growth was rapid, fueled by abundant food and favorable conditions. The transition from larva to adult transformed them into aerial weapons. The influence of these flying giants extended far beyond predation. By controlling insect populations, they shaped plant communities. Herbivorous insects were kept in check, preventing them from overwhelming vegetation. This allowed forests to remain dense and diverse in this way. Aerial predators acted as regulators of entire ecosystems, maintaining balance through fear and death. Yet their reign was fragile. It depended entirely on the unique atmospheric conditions of the time. As climate patterns shifted and oxygen levels began to decline, the advantages that supported giant flight started to disappear. Thicker bodies became liabilities. Wings that once lifted easily struggled against thinner air. Flight endurance dropped. Predators that relied on aerial dominance faced an uncertain future. As forests fragmented and environments dried, suitable habitats for both larvae and adults shrank. Water sources became less stable. Storms grew more unpredictable. The very conditions that had once supported gigantism now turned against it. Smaller, more adaptable insects began to thrive, requiring fewer resources and less stable environments. Vertebrates, too, were changing. Early reptiles evolved stronger lungs and more efficient breathing systems. While still grounded, they represented the future of large terrestrial life. The age of insect dominance was beginning to wane, not through sudden extinction, but through gradual disadvantage. Evolution favored flexibility over sheer size. This chapter represents the peak of the skies as a realm of terror. Never again would insects rule the air at such scale. The Carboniferous atmosphere allowed a brief window where flight, size, and predation combined into something truly monstrous. These flying giants were not side notes in history. They were apex predators of their world, shaping behavior, evolution, and survival across entire continents. Long before birds or bats ever took flight, the sky already had its rulers, silent, fast, and unstoppable. They turned the air into a hunting ground. And for millions of years, every movement beneath the canopy carried the risk of death from above. While the skies were ruled by giant flying predators and the swamps echoed with the movement of early amphibians, the forest floor belonged to something even more unsettling. Deep beneath the towering plants of the Carboniferous, enormous invertebrates crawled through shadows, their bodies segmented, armored, and relentless. This was the domain of giant land arthropods, and none symbolized this world more vividly than Arthropleura, the largest land invertebrate to ever exist. The Carboniferous forests were unlike any modern environment. The ground was soft, soaked with moisture, and layered with decaying plant matter. Fallen trunks, tangled roots, and dense undergrowth created a maze of narrow paths and hidden chambers. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor. In this dim, humid world, size did not hinder movement. It enhanced it. Long bodies could navigate around obstacles, slip between roots, and dominate territory through sheer presence. Arthropleura was not a predator in the traditional sense, but it was still terrifying. Stretching several meters in length, its segmented body was covered in overlapping armored plates. Each segment moved independently, allowing it to curve, coil, and maneuver with surprising precision. Its dozens of legs moved in coordinated waves, producing a slow but unstoppable motion. To smaller animals, it was not simply large. It was the landscape itself, alive and moving. Arthropleura fed primarily on decaying plant material, fallen leaves, and possibly soft vegetation. Yet its diet did not make it harmless. Its size alone made it an ecological force. Anything too slow or too small to escape risked being crushed beneath its body. Its armored exterior provided protection against most threats, including early vertebrates and smaller arthropod predators. In an environment where oxygen was abundant and competition was low, it had little reason to fear attack. The presence of such massive invertebrates reshaped forest ecosystems. Arthropleura played a crucial role in breaking down plant matter, recycling nutrients back into the soil. Its movement churned the forest floor, aerating the ground and influencing plant growth. Entire micro-ecosystems formed in its wake, benefiting from disturbed soil and exposed organic material. In this way, it functioned as both a giant and an engineer. Yet, not all giant land arthropods were passive feeders. Alongside Arthropleura lived massive scorpions, spiders, and predatory insects that actively hunted. These creatures used ambush tactics, vibration sensing, and chemical detection to locate prey in low-visibility environments. The forest floor was a place where movement meant danger. Every step carried risk, and survival depended on awareness and timing. Size among these arthropods offered more than just intimidation. Larger bodies retained moisture more effectively, reducing the risk of dehydration. Thicker exoskeletons provided insulation against temperature swings. Mass allowed these animals to push through vegetation and obstacles that would trap smaller creatures. In a swamp forest, where conditions were stable and resources plentiful, being large was an advantage in nearly every way. Early amphibians shared this world uneasily. While some were capable predators, they were still vulnerable. Their skin required constant moisture, tying them to water sources. Encounters with giant arthropods could be deadly, not always through direct attack, but through competition and displacement. A massive Arthropleura moving through an area could destroy shelter, block access to food, or force smaller animals into exposed positions. Predation pressure on the forest floor was intense. Insects evolved hard shells, spines, and chemical defenses. Some became nocturnal, moving only under cover of darkness. Others burrowed deeper into soil or wood to avoid detection. Still, the presence of giants meant no defense was absolute. Even hiding carried risk if a massive body passed overhead. The Carboniferous environment also allowed these giants to reproduce successfully. Stable climates, constant moisture, and abundant food supported long growth periods. Juveniles could grow slowly without facing immediate extinction. This stability was essential. Large arthropods required years to reach full size, and any disruption to their environment could be catastrophic. However, Gigantism came with limitations. Molting remained a dangerous necessity. Shedding an exoskeleton left even the largest arthropod temporarily defenseless. During these periods, animals had to hide completely, retreating into burrows or dense cover. Failure meant death. This vulnerability placed an upper limit on size and influenced behavior. Even the largest giants lived cautiously. As the Carboniferous progressed, environmental changes began to challenge these giants. Climates shifted, and some regions became drier, and swamp forests fragmented into isolated patches. Moisture became less reliable. Oxygen levels fluctuated. For animals dependent on specific conditions, these changes were devastating. Large arthropods could not migrate quickly, nor could they adapt rapidly to dry environments. At the same time, vertebrates continued to evolve. Early reptiles developed tougher skin that resisted dehydration. They laid eggs with protective shells, freeing reproduction from water. These traits allowed them to colonize environments beyond swamps. While still smaller than the largest arthropods, they were more adaptable. Over time, adaptability would prove more valuable than size. The decline of giant land arthropods was gradual. There was no single moment of collapse. Populations shrank as habitats disappeared. Species became isolated and eventually vanished. Arthropleura, once a dominant presence across vast forests, faded into extinction as the world changed around it. Yet its existence remains one of the most extreme examples of terrestrial gigantism. No insect or arthropod has ever matched its size since. Its disappearance marks the end of an era when invertebrates ruled the land not through speed or venom, but through sheer mass and endurance. This chapter captures the moment when the forest floor itself was alive with giants. Long before dinosaurs cast shadows across the earth, the ground already trembled beneath armored bodies moving silently through the dark. The monsters of this world did not roar or hunt in packs. They advanced slowly, relentlessly, reshaping ecosystems simply by existing, and for millions of years nothing on land could challenge them. As the Carboniferous forests matured and oxygen-rich air continued to shape life on land, vertebrates began to rise into forms that could finally rival the giants around them. Among these pioneers were the early amphibians, animals caught between water and land, carrying the legacy of fish while experimenting with the terrestrial future. They were no longer small shoreline survivors. Some grew into massive predators, becoming the first true vertebrate giants to dominate land long before reptiles and dinosaurs. These amphibians inherited bodies built for two worlds. Their limbs, once fins, had become strong enough to lift and move heavy bodies across mud, vegetation, and shallow water. Their skulls flattened and widened, filled with sharp teeth designed for gripping slippery prey. Their skin remained moist and permeable, tying them to humid environments, but this limitation was offset by the abundance of swamps, rivers, and wetlands that covered much of the planet. Size became their greatest weapon. In ecosystems crowded with giant insects and arthropods, growing larger allowed amphibians to exploit a new food source. Enormous insects were slow, plentiful, and defenseless against vertebrate jaws. An amphibian, capable of ambush, could feed efficiently with minimal effort. Energy intake increased, growth accelerated, and natural selection favored larger bodies over time. Some amphibians reached lengths comparable to modern crocodiles. Their hunting strategy was simple and effective. Early amphibian giants relied on ambush rather than pursuit. They waited motionless near water edges, beneath vegetation, or within shallow pools. When prey approached, they struck with explosive force, snapping powerful jaws, shut in a fraction of a second. Teeth, curved inward, prevented escape. Even large arthropods stood little chance once caught. Water remained central to their lifestyle. Despite their size, these amphibians were not fully terrestrial. Reproduction still required water, as eggs lacked protective shells and larvae developed with gills. This anchored them to wet environments, but it also placed them at the heart of some of the richest ecosystems on Earth. Wetlands concentrated life, drawing insects, smaller vertebrates, and other amphibians into dense food webs. Competition among amphibians intensified as more species grew larger. Territorial behavior likely emerged, with dominant individuals controlling access to prime hunting grounds. Conflicts were probably violent and brief, and size and jaw strength decided outcomes quickly. Injuries could be fatal, as healing was slow and infection common in warm, humid environments. Their sensory systems adapted to land in important ways. Smell became more refined, allowing detection of prey and rivals through chemical cues in air. Hearing improved, enabling response to vibrations and low-frequency sounds. Eyes adjusted to new lighting conditions, functioning both above and below water. These changes made amphibians effective predators across multiple environments, increasing their ecological reach. Giant amphibians also played a critical role in shaping ecosystems. By preying on large insects, they helped regulate arthropod populations that might otherwise overwhelm vegetation. Their movement through swamps disturbed sediment and plant matter, influencing nutrient cycling. Carcasses left behind fed scavengers and decomposers, linking terrestrial and aquatic food chains. Yet their success came with inherent weaknesses. Their skin, while effective for respiration, made them vulnerable to dehydration. Even short exposure to dry conditions could be deadly. Temperature regulation was also limited. Cold slowed their metabolism, reducing mobility and reaction speed. These constraints confined giant amphibians to specific habitats and climates. As environments began to change toward the late Carboniferous and early Permian, these limitations became more pronounced. Swamp forests started to fragment. Seasonal dryness increased in some regions. Water sources became less predictable. Habitats that once supported massive amphibians shrank or disappeared entirely. At the same time, new competitors emerged. Early reptiles evolved key adaptations that amphibians lacked. Their skin became tougher and more resistant to water loss. Their eggs developed protective shells, allowing reproduction away from water. Lungs became more efficient, supporting higher activity levels in drier environments. These traits did not make reptiles immediately dominant, but they gave them flexibility amphibians could not match. Giant amphibians faced a narrowing world. Where wetlands remained, they continued to dominate. But where land dried, they could not follow. Reptiles moved into these new spaces, avoiding competition and slowly expanding their range over millions of years. This quiet expansion shifted the balance of power. Predation pressure also changed. As reptiles diversified, some began to prey on amphibian eggs and juveniles, exploiting their dependence on water. Survival rates declined. populations became more fragmented. Genetic diversity dropped, reducing resilience to environmental stress. Still, for a long span of time, amphibian giants ruled their domains without challenge. In the shadows of ancient forests, they were the undisputed apex predators. Their presence marked the first time vertebrates truly dominated land ecosystems, setting the stage for everything that followed. Their legacy is often overlooked, overshadowed by later reptiles and dinosaurs. Yet without these early giants, terrestrial ecosystems would have developed very differently. They bridged a critical evolutionary gap, proving that large vertebrate predators could survive and thrive on land. This chapter represents the moment when land finally had its own monsters. Not insects, not arthropods, but animals with backbones, jaws, and limbs built for ambush and power. The age of amphibian giants was brief in geological terms, but its impact was permanent. It was the final rehearsal before reptiles would take the stage, carrying gigantism to even greater extremes. For millions of years, in steaming wetlands and shadowed swamps, these giants waited beneath the surface, and in that silence, the future of terrestrial life was being shaped. As Earth moved into the Permian period, the world entered a phase of transformation more dramatic than anything before it. The humid, oxygen-rich swamps that once supported giant insects and massive amphibians began to fade. Continents collided, forming the vast supercontinent Pangaea, reshaping climate patterns on a global scale. Coastlines shrank, interiors dried, and seasonal extremes intensified. This was no longer a planet of endless wetlands. It was becoming a harsher, more unpredictable world. And in this new environment, the giants of the past faced their greatest test. The Permian climate was defined by contrast. Coastal regions still supported life-rich ecosystems, but vast inland areas became dry, hot, and hostile. Deserts expanded, and rainfall became irregular. Temperatures swung violently between seasons. For animals tied to water and moisture, these changes were devastating. Amphibian giants that once dominated swamps found their habitats shrinking year by year. Survival now demanded new solutions. This challenge gave rise to a new kind of giant. Early reptiles and synapsids began to emerge as dominant land animals. Unlike amphibians, these creatures were no longer bound to water for reproduction or survival. Their skin was tougher, reducing water loss. Their eggs were protected by membranes or shells, allowing development away from water. Lungs became more efficient, supporting higher activity levels even in dry air. These adaptations were subtle at first, but their impact was enormous. Synapsids, often misunderstood as primitive reptiles, represented a major evolutionary leap. Their skulls featured a single temporal opening behind the eye, allowing stronger jaw muscles and more powerful bites. This gave them an advantage as predators and herbivores alike. Teeth diversified into different shapes, enabling more efficient feeding. Some synapsids became massive herbivores, while others evolved into terrifying carnivores that dominated dry land ecosystems. Size returned as a winning strategy, but now it was paired with endurance rather than reliance on oxygen-rich air. Permian giants were built for long-distance movement across open terrain. Limbs moved beneath the body rather than sprawled to the sides, improving efficiency and reducing energy loss. These animals could patrol large territories, migrate in response to changing conditions, and exploit food sources far from water. Predatory synapsids became the new apex hunters. Their skulls housed powerful jaws filled with differentiated teeth capable of slicing flesh and crushing bone. Ambush was still effective, but pursuit hunting became increasingly common. Prey animals could no longer rely solely on hiding or armor. Speed, stamina, and awareness became essential for survival. Herbivorous giants also reshaped the landscape. Massive plant eaters consumed enormous amounts of vegetation, influencing plant distribution and evolution. Some plants developed tougher tissues, chemical defenses, or rapid growth cycles in response. Entire ecosystems reorganized around these interactions. The Permian land was no longer dominated by forests alone. Open woodlands and scrublands spread, shaped by grazing and climate. Competition intensified as amphibians declined and reptiles expanded. In shrinking wetland refuges, amphibian giants continued to survive, but they were increasingly isolated. Predators learned to exploit these environments, targeting vulnerable life stages such as eggs and juveniles. Each generation faced greater pressure than the last. Extinction did not come suddenly, but it was relentless. The oceans were also changing. Marine ecosystems faced declining oxygen levels and altered circulation patterns. Reef systems collapsed and many marine giants disappeared. This instability rippled onto land. Food chains weakened. Resources became unpredictable. For large animals, especially specialists, survival became increasingly difficult. Yet, some Permian giants thrived in this chaos. Adaptability became the most valuable trait. Animals capable of switching diets, tolerating temperature extremes, and migrating long distances gained an edge. Body size alone was no longer enough. Intelligence, behavior, and physiology now mattered just as much as raw power. Toward the late Permian, the world entered a period of escalating stress. Massive volcanic activity released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, driving rapid warming. Acid rain damaged vegetation. Oxygen levels dropped. Deserts expanded further. Ecosystems began to unravel. Even the most adaptable giants struggled to cope. Predators found prey harder to locate. Herbivores faced declining plant diversity and nutritional quality. Reproductive success dropped. Populations fragmented. Disease spread more easily among stressed animals. The planet was approaching a breaking point. This era represents the last stand of many pre-dinosaur giants. Synapsids that once ruled the land began to decline. Amphibians vanished from all but the most protected refuges. Insects shrank in size as oxygen levels fell. The grand experiment of gigantism that began in ancient seas and forests was nearing its end. Yet, this collapse was not meaningless. It cleared ecological space on a massive scale. Niches once filled by dominant giants would soon stand empty. Survivors would inherit a reshaped world, one forged by catastrophe and selection. The Permian giants were not failures. They were pioneers who pushed life to its limits. Their legacy lived on in the traits they left behind. Efficient limbs, powerful jaws, differentiated teeth, and advanced respiration would all be inherited by future lineages. The next rulers of Earth would not emerge from nothing. They would rise from the ashes of this age, carrying forward the lessons learned by those who came before. This chapter marks the final chapter of an ancient world, a world where the first giants of land and sea had tested every possibility. As the Permian drew to a close, Earth stood on the edge of the greatest extinction it would ever face. What survived would shape the future. What vanished would become legend. And in the silence left behind, a new era waited to begin. The end did not arrive quietly. It came as a slow tightening of the world, followed by collapse so complete that it reshaped the course of life forever. At the close of the Permian, Earth experienced the greatest mass extinction in its history. It was not a single event, but a cascade of disasters unfolding over hundreds of thousands of years. By the time it was over, nearly all of the giants that had ruled the planet long before dinosaurs were gone. The warning signs appeared early. Climates became unstable beyond anything life had experienced before. Seasons grew extreme. Droughts lasted longer. Heat waves intensified. Rainfall patterns collapsed. Environments that once supported enormous animals became unreliable, then uninhabitable. Ecosystems frayed as food chains broke apart piece by piece. Deep within the planet, massive volcanic eruptions began in what is now Siberia. These eruptions did not last days or years. They continued for hundreds of thousands of years, releasing vast amounts of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur compounds, and ash into the atmosphere. The sky darkened. Temperatures rose rapidly. Oceans warmed, expanded, and stagnated. The balance that had allowed giants to thrive was destroyed. On land, rising temperatures dried remaining wetlands, forests withered and burned, soil eroded without plant roots to hold it in place. Herbivorous giants struggled first, as vegetation declined in both quantity and quality. Without reliable food, growth slowed, reproduction failed, and populations collapsed. Predators soon followed, starved by the disappearance of their prey. The air itself became hostile. Oxygen levels dropped while toxic gases increased. Breathing became harder for large animals with high metabolic demands. Smaller, more adaptable species fared better, but even they suffered mass death events. Left landscapes littered with carcasses, further destabilizing ecosystems and spreading disease. The oceans were hit even harder. Warming waters lost oxygen, creating vast dead zones where most marine life could not survive. Acidification dissolved shells and disrupted food webs from the bottom up. Plankton declined, removing the foundation of marine ecosystems. Reefs collapsed. Giant marine predators lost their prey and vanished. What makes this extinction uniquely devastating is its scale. Estimates suggest that over 90% of marine species and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrates disappeared. Entire groups that had dominated for tens of millions of years were wiped out. Giant arthropods, amphibian titans, dominant synapsid predators, and countless other forms of life simply ended. For the giants, size became a fatal disadvantage. Large bodies required large amounts of food, stable environments, and reliable oxygen levels. When those vanished, giants could not adapt quickly enough. Long lifespans and slow reproduction made recovery impossible. Evolution favored small, fast-reproducing organisms capable of surviving in fragmented, hostile environments. Yet, even in catastrophe, life did not completely vanish. Scattered survivors endured in refuges where conditions were slightly less extreme. Burrowing animals escaped heat and radiation. Small reptiles with efficient lungs and low water requirements survived where amphibians could not. Hardy plants capable of rapid growth colonized devastated landscapes. These survivors were not dominant. They were simply resilient. The extinction did not reset life to zero. It filtered it. Traits that had once been secondary now became critical. Efficiency replaced size. Adaptability replaced dominance. Endurance replaced power. The world that emerged afterward was quieter, emptier, and simpler, but it was not lifeless. In the aftermath, ecosystems took millions of years to recover. Forests returned slowly. Soils stabilized. Oceans gradually regained oxygen. New food webs formed, initially fragile and unstable. For a long time, large animals were rare. The planet remained hostile and life advanced cautiously. But the stage had been cleared, the extinction removed. Long-established giants that had monopolized ecosystems for ages. Ecological space opened on a scale never seen before. Empty niches waited to be filled. Evolution, given time, would respond. From the survivors of this apocalypse came the ancestors of future rulers. Small reptiles diversified rapidly, experimenting with new body plans, behaviors, and strategies. Some grew larger. Others became faster. A few began to dominate specific environments. These lineages would eventually give rise to archosaurs, the group that included crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. The giants before dinosaurs were not failures. They were pioneers that pushed life to its limits under conditions that no longer existed. Their rise and fall revealed the boundaries of biology and environment. They showed what was possible when oxygen was abundant, climates were stable, and competition favored size. And they showed what happened when those conditions collapsed. Their extinction reshaped evolution itself. And after this event, life became more cautious in its experiments. Gigantism would return, but never in the same way. Future giants would rely on different strategies, different anatomies, and different ecosystems. The world had learned that size alone was not enough. This chapter closes the age of the first monsters. Long before dinosaurs captured human imagination, Earth had already been ruled by creatures just as terrifying, just as dominant, and in many ways more alien. They ruled oceans, skies, forests, and swamps for hundreds of millions of years. They shaped the planet in silence, without witnesses. When they vanished, they left behind a transformed world and a warning written into the fossil record. Dominance is temporary. Environments change. Only adaptability endures. From the ashes of this extinction, a new chapter of life would begin. Dinosaurs would rise into a world already shaped by catastrophe, inheriting a planet emptied of its former rulers. But their story belongs to another age. This story belongs to the giants that came before. After the greatest extinction Earth had ever known, the planet entered a long, uneasy silence. The landscapes left behind were stripped and unfamiliar, shaped not by abundance, but by survival. Forests were sparse and patchy. Rivers carried sediment through empty floodplains. Coastlines were quiet, their once complex ecosystems reduced to simplified chains of life, struggling to reassemble. This was the aftermath world. a planet recovering from near total collapse. The air was still heavy and unstable. Oxygen levels remained lower than during the ages of giants, limiting how large animals could grow. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, and extreme weather events were common. For millions of years, life existed in a state of recovery rather than expansion. The planet was no longer a place that rewarded excess. It favored efficiency, resilience, and flexibility above all else. In this fragile world, the survivors spread cautiously. Small reptiles diversified rapidly, not because conditions were ideal, but because competition was almost non-existent. With so many dominant lineages erased, even modest adaptations could open vast ecological opportunities. Evolution accelerated, driven not by arms races between giants, but by the race to occupy empty space. The early ecosystems of this recovery phase were simple and unstable. Food webs were short. Predators were small. Prey species reproduced quickly, often in massive numbers, compensating for high mortality. Plants adapted to poor soils and harsh climates, favoring rapid growth over longevity. Forests took millions of years to regain anything resembling their former complexity. This was the beginning of the Triassic period, an era defined not by immediate dominance, but by experimentation. Reptiles explored new ways of moving, breathing, and feeding. Limbs shifted beneath bodies, improving endurance and efficiency. Lungs became more advanced. Metabolism increased. These changes were subtle, but they laid the groundwork for future gigantism under very different rules. Unlike the giants that came before, these new animals did not rely on extreme oxygen levels or swampy stability. They were built for a variable world. They could endure droughts, temperature swings, and food scarcity. Reproduction was more efficient. Growth was faster. Survival was no longer tied to a narrow set of environmental conditions. For a long time, there were no true giants. The planet remained cautious. Whenever animals began to increase in size, environmental stress pushed back. This created a balance that kept ecosystems from tipping too far in any direction. Life advanced in steps rather than leaps, rebuilding complexity layer by layer. Yet the legacy of the ancient giants was still present, written into anatomy and behavior. Powerful jaws, differentiated teeth, efficient locomotion, and advanced sensory systems all trace their origins to the worlds that came before. Evolution does not forget. It repurposes. The survivors carried fragments of ancient success into a new age. Slowly, as climates stabilized and ecosystems recovered, the possibility of large body size returned. Plants diversified, forming new kinds of forests. Prey species increased in size and abundance. Predators followed. But this time, gigantism emerged cautiously, guided by lessons learned through catastrophe. The dinosaurs, when they finally appeared, did not rise into an untouched world. They inherited a planet shaped by hundreds of millions of years of trial and failure. The giants before them had already explored every extreme. They had tested the limits of oxygen, size, armor, and power. They had ruled seas, skies, forests, and swamps. And they had fallen when the world changed. This final chapter is not about dominance, but about perspective. Dinosaurs were not the beginning of terror on Earth. They were the continuation of a long story written by creatures far older and stranger. The true age of monsters began long before dinosaurs and ended not with a single impact, but with a slow, devastating unraveling of the world itself. The Giants that roamed before dinosaurs are often forgotten because they lived in worlds alien to us. Yet without them, the Earth we know would not exist. They shaped the atmosphere, the soil, the oceans, and the very rules by which life evolves. They proved that nature has no preference for gentleness, only for what works. Their story is a reminder that dominance is temporary, but influence is eternal. Even in extinction, they shaped the future. And in the quiet recovery that followed their fall, a new chapter of life waited patiently to begin. As recovery continued, the world slowly began to test its limits again. The silence that followed the Great Extinction did not last forever. Ecosystems, once reduced to fragile networks, started gaining complexity. Plants diversified into new forms, better suited to dry and unpredictable climates. Soils stabilized. Rivers carved permanent paths again. With stability came opportunity, and with opportunity came the slow return of size. This was not a sudden resurgence of giants. Evolution moved carefully, shaped by the memory of collapse written into the genetic history of life itself. Animals that grew too large, too quickly, were punished by scarcity. Those that balanced growth with efficiency survived. The planet was teaching a new lesson. Power without resilience meant extinction. Reptiles continued to diversify into increasingly specialized forms. Some became swift runners, using long limbs and light bodies to chase prey across open ground. Others adopted ambush strategies, relying on camouflage and patience. Teeth diversified further, reflecting increasingly complex diets. Herbivores evolved stronger jaws to process tougher plants. Carnivores refined slicing and tearing mechanisms rather than brute crushing force. The landscape itself encouraged change. Unlike the swamp-dominated worlds of earlier eras, this planet featured open floodplains, seasonal forests, and semi-arid regions. Mobility mattered more than ever. Animals capable of traveling long distances in search of food and water gained an advantage. This favored upright limb posture, efficient breathing, and improved stamina. Predation pressure increased steadily. As prey species became more abundant, predators followed. Food chains lengthened. Competition returned. Once again, size became tempting. Larger animals could control territory, intimidate rivals, and access new food sources. But this time, size evolved alongside structural efficiency. Bodies became lighter relative to mass. Skeletons redistributed weight more effectively. Lungs and circulatory systems improved to support sustained activity. The first truly large land animals of the post-extinction world were not monsters in the old sense. They were cautious giants. Limited by environmental checks and balances, growth was slower. Reproduction was more strategic. Survival depended not just on dominance, but on timing and adaptability. The oceans mirrored this process. Marine ecosystems recovered unevenly. Some regions remained oxygen poor for millions of years, limiting size. Others stabilized more quickly, allowing larger predators to emerge. Sharks and other cartilaginous fish diversified, filling niches once held by long-extinct armored giants. Their flexible skeletons and efficient swimming made them well-suited to a changing ocean. Yet even as new predators appeared, the scale remained restrained. The planet was not ready for excess. Climate fluctuations continued to reset ecosystems, before gigantism could spiral out of control. Extinction events still occurred, but they were smaller and more localized. Life learned to recover faster, building redundancy into food webs. This gradual rebuilding created a world fundamentally different from the one that existed before the Great Collapse. Earlier giants had thrived in stable, oxygen-rich environments where competition rewarded size above all else. Now, instability was the norm. Animals that survived were those that could endure loss, adapt behavior, and exploit short windows of opportunity. The memory of ancient giants still influenced evolution. Certain traits reappeared repeatedly, refined rather than repeated. Strong jaws returned, but paired with lighter skulls. Large bodies emerged, but supported by more efficient limbs. Predatory strategies favored endurance and intelligence rather than sheer force. Gigantism became a tool, not a gamble. As millions of years passed, this cautious experimentation laid the groundwork for the next great radiation of life. Ecosystems reached a tipping point where complexity and stability finally aligned. Food was abundant. Climates became more predictable. Oxygen levels stabilized. The planet once again became capable of supporting giants. But these future giants would not resemble those that came before. They would not rely on arthropod exoskeletons, extreme oxygen concentrations, or swamp-bound ecosystems. They would be creatures of balance, shaped by movement, efficiency, and adaptability. The giants before dinosaurs had written the first draft of domination. They explored every extreme, pushing life to its physical and environmental limits. They proved that Earth could support monsters in sea, air, and land. They also proved that those monsters were vulnerable when conditions changed. This chapter exists as a bridge between ages. It marks the moment when Earth stopped experimenting recklessly and began refining its designs. The future belonged not to the largest or strongest alone, but to those capable of surviving change. And as the world stabilized further, the stage quietly prepared itself for the next rulers. They would inherit the lessons of extinction, carry the tools forged by ancient giants, and rise into a world finally ready for them. The age of dinosaurs was approaching, but it would stand on the bones of countless giants that came before. As time moved forward, the planet reached a rare equilibrium. The chaos that followed the Great Extinction slowly settled into patterns that repeated year after year, century after century. Climates stabilized enough for ecosystems to mature, yet remained unpredictable enough to punish over-specialization. This balance created a world where life could grow, but only if it remained adaptable. It was within this narrow window that the foundations of the next age were quietly laid. Landscapes became more open than ever before. Dense swamp forests were no longer the dominant feature of the planet. Instead, wide floodplains, seasonal woodlands, and arid regions spread across continents. Water was still essential, but it was no longer everywhere. Animals had to travel to find it. This reshaped behavior, favoring creatures that could move efficiently over long distances and survive temporary scarcity. Plants adapted first. New types of vegetation evolved: tougher tissues, deeper roots, and faster growth cycles. They could survive drought, fire, and grazing pressure. This created a more resilient base for food webs. Herbivores followed, evolving teeth capable of processing fibrous plants and digestive systems that extracted maximum energy from limited resources. Grazing and browsing became powerful forces shaping the land. With herbivores came predators. But unlike earlier ages, predators now faced prey that could run far, hide effectively, and recover quickly through reproduction. Hunting became a test of strategy rather than brute strength. Intelligence, coordination, and timing mattered more than raw size alone. The most successful hunters were not necessarily the largest, but the most efficient. This new dynamic slowed the return of extreme gigantism. Animals still grew larger, but growth was controlled. Bodies became taller rather than heavier. Limbs aligned beneath the body to reduce energy loss. Tails balanced movement. Breathing systems supported sustained activity rather than short bursts of power. These were not the traits of ancient monsters. They were the traits of endurance. The air itself reflected this change. Oxygen levels no longer reached the extremes of the Carboniferous. Flight remained possible, but it demanded precision and efficiency. Giant insects did not return. Instead, smaller flying animals thrived, agile and adaptable. The sky became less about dominance and more about opportunity. Survival favored control rather than size. On the ground, competition intensified. As ecosystems filled, space became limited. Territories formed, migration routes emerged. Animals that could remember landscapes, seasons, and resources gained advantages. Behavior became as important as anatomy. Learning, memory, and social interaction began to influence survival in ways unseen in earlier ages. The oceans mirrored this transformation. Marine life rebounded unevenly but steadily. Predators returned, though rarely reaching the monstrous scales of the distant past. Instead, efficiency ruled. Streamlined bodies, sensitive sensory systems, and flexible feeding strategies dominated. The ocean was no longer a place for heavily armored giants. It favored speed, adaptability, and energy conservation. This era marked a shift in how life explored dominance. Earlier giants had relied on singular advantages: extreme size, overwhelming armor, and crushing jaws. Now, success came from combinations of traits: moderate size paired with intelligence, strength balanced by speed, specialization tempered by flexibility. Evolution had learned restraint. The shadow of past extinctions still shaped this world. Whenever ecosystems began pushing too far toward imbalance, environmental pressure responded: droughts, temperature shifts, resource shortages. These were not apocalyptic, but they were corrective. They prevented life from repeating the same mistakes that had once led to near total collapse. Yet within these constraints, life continued to innovate. New body plans emerged, new modes of movement appeared. Social behaviors began to influence survival and reproduction. Animals that cooperated gained advantages over those that acted alone. Group vigilance reduced predation risk. Coordinated hunting increased success. This social dimension added another layer to evolution. The giants of the past would not have thrived here. Their dependence on stable, resource-rich environments would have been fatal. This world demanded constant adjustment. It rewarded those that could respond to change rather than dominate it. And still, beneath this restraint, the potential for greatness grew. Each generation refined traits that would one day support true dominance again. Limbs grew stronger, lungs more efficient, nervous systems more complex. Life was not abandoning gigantism. It was preparing for it differently. This chapter represents a quiet but crucial phase in Earth's history, not an age of monsters, but an age of preparation. And the planet was learning how to support large animals without collapsing. Life was learning how to grow powerful without becoming fragile. The giants before dinosaurs had shown what was possible when conditions allowed unchecked growth. They had also shown the cost of imbalance. Now, evolution sought a middle path. When the next rulers finally emerged, they would do so in a world shaped by caution, resilience, and hard lessons learned through extinction. Their rise would appear sudden in the fossil record, but it would be built on foundations laid slowly, patiently, across millions of years. This chapter closes the long transition between worlds. The age of ancient giants had ended. The age of recovery had matured, and the planet once again stood ready to test how far life could go. With the planet finally stabilized, evolution began accelerating in ways that would have seemed impossible during the long recovery. Ecosystems were now layered, resilient, and interconnected. Plants anchored the land. Herbivores shaped vegetation through constant pressure. Predators refined hunting strategies that balanced risk and reward. This was no longer a world rebuilding from disaster. It was a world testing its strength again. Size returned as an evolutionary temptation, but it emerged under new rules. Growing larger now required efficiency rather than excess. Bodies were engineered to move farther on less energy. Limbs aligned beneath the torso to support weight without waste. Muscles worked in coordinated chains. Breathing and circulation delivered oxygen precisely where it was needed. This integration allowed animals to scale up without becoming fragile. Competition intensified as niches filled. Animals could no longer rely on novelty alone. Success depended on outperforming rivals across multiple dimensions at once. Strength without speed failed. Speed without endurance failed. Specialization without flexibility failed. The winners were those that balanced traits, adapting behavior as readily as anatomy. Predators refined tactics that minimized energy loss. Ambush returned as a dominant strategy in many environments, but it was now paired with pursuit when needed. Animals learned to read terrain, predict prey movement, and choose battles carefully. Failed hunts were costly. Patience and timing mattered as much as power. Herbivores responded by growing taller, faster, or more social. Some relied on vigilance within groups, detecting danger early. Others developed defensive structures that discouraged attack rather than stopping it outright. Intimidation became a tool. A large silhouette, a sudden display, or a coordinated response could turn a predator away before a chase even began. The environment itself selected against extremes. Droughts returned seasonally, temperatures shifted, food availability fluctuated. Animals that could store energy, migrate, or switch diets survived. Those that could not disappeared quietly. Extinction did not vanish from the planet. It became a constant background force, trimming excess and maintaining balance. This world also favored neurological advancement. Animals that could learn from experience remember landscapes, and adjust behavior had an edge. Intelligence reduced wasted effort. It allowed predators to abandon unproductive tactics and prey to recognize danger sooner over time. This feedback loop favored increasingly complex nervous systems. Social behavior expanded alongside intelligence. Group living offered protection, improved foraging, and shared vigilance. Predators that coordinated gained access to prey otherwise too large or too fast for a single hunter. Prey that communicated reduced individual risk. These dynamics reshaped ecosystems, adding layers of interaction unseen in earlier ages. In the oceans, a similar pattern unfolded. Predators refined hunting strategies that emphasized efficiency and sensory awareness. Armor faded in importance. Speed, stealth, and precision dominated. Marine food webs stabilized around these principles, mirroring changes on land. The sea no longer produced singular monsters that ruled by mass alone. It produced networks of capable competitors. The memory of ancient giants still influenced evolution indirectly. Their fossils shaped landscapes. Their extinctions shaped opportunity. The absence of those dominant forms allowed new lineages to experiment without immediate suppression. Evolution is not just about what appears, but about what is no longer there. As millions of years passed, certain lineages began pushing size again, cautiously but persistently. Juveniles grew faster. Adults lived longer. Reproductive strategies balanced investment with output. Populations stabilized at larger body sizes without collapsing ecosystems. This was the key difference from the distant past. Growth no longer outpaced support. The planet itself reinforced this balance. Feedback mechanisms between vegetation, climate, and animal behavior dampened extremes. Grazing shaped plant communities. Plants influenced climate through carbon cycling. Climate constrained animal distribution. No single force dominated for long. Stability emerged not from stasis, but from constant adjustment. This phase marked a philosophical shift in how life expressed dominance. Earlier ages rewarded spectacle. Now they rewarded sustainability. Success was measured not by how large an animal could become, but by how long its lineage could persist. Dominance that endured mattered more than dominance that impressed. This does not mean the world became gentle. Predation remained brutal. Competition remained unforgiving. Death was constant, but it was no longer wasteful on a planetary scale. Ecosystems absorbed loss without unraveling. Resilience had become a defining property of life itself. The stage was now fully prepared. The conditions that had once produced unchecked giants had been replaced by conditions that could support large, complex animals without collapsing. When new rulers finally emerged, they would do so into a system capable of sustaining them. This chapter represents the final alignment. Anatomy, behavior, environment, and climate converged into a framework where power could return without catastrophe. The planet had learned from its own history. Life had learned restraint. What came next would appear dramatic in the fossil record. Diversification would accelerate. Body sizes would increase. Dominance would re-emerge. But unlike the ancient giants that rose and fell with environmental whim, the next rulers would be supported by a world designed to endure their presence. The giants before dinosaurs were the teachers. Through their rise and extinction, they defined the boundaries of possibility. This chapter marks the moment those lessons were finally integrated. The planet was ready again. With the planet now operating under a new balance, evolution entered its most decisive phase yet. The long preparation was complete. Ecosystems were stable enough to support complexity, yet dynamic enough to prevent stagnation. Food webs had depth. Climates, while still variable, followed recognizable patterns. Oxygen levels were sufficient to sustain active, large-bodied animals without reaching the dangerous extremes of the distant past. For the first time since the Great Collapse, Earth was truly ready for long-term dominance by large terrestrial life. This readiness did not announce itself through a single revolutionary species. Instead, it emerged through a convergence of traits across multiple lineages. Efficient locomotion, advanced respiration, refined sensory systems, and increasingly complex behavior all appeared together. None of these traits alone guaranteed success. Together, they created a new evolutionary standard. Animals now moved differently than their ancient predecessors. Limbs were no longer sprawled wide, dragging heavy bodies across the ground. They aligned beneath the torso, allowing muscles and bones to work in vertical support rather than constant strain. This posture reduced energy loss and allowed sustained movement over long distances. Endurance replaced brute strength as the foundation of power. This shift fundamentally changed what it meant to be large. Earlier giants relied on mass to overwhelm environments. These new animals relied on efficiency to outlast them. They could travel farther to find food, escape worsening conditions, and migrate in response to seasonal change. Size became an advantage only when paired with mobility. Respiration also evolved in step with movement. Lungs became more compartmentalized, extracting oxygen more effectively with each breath. Circulation systems improved, delivering oxygen precisely where it was needed. This supported higher activity levels without exhausting the animal. Sustained motion, rather than explosive bursts, defined success. Predation strategies reflected this new reality. Hunts were no longer reckless charges or single violent encounters. They became calculated processes. Predators assessed risk, selected targets, and abandoned pursuits that wasted energy. Ambush remained important, but it was paired with endurance when needed. The goal was not dominance in a moment, but survival across seasons. Prey species adapted in parallel. Speed increased, but so did awareness. Group behavior expanded. Early forms of coordinated movement and collective vigilance appeared, reducing individual risk. Animals learned to read subtle environmental cues, reacting to disturbances long before predators were visible. Survival increasingly depended on information as much as anatomy. This informational layer marked a profound change. Earlier ecosystems were driven primarily by physical interactions. Now, perception, learning, and memory-shaped outcomes. Animals that could remember migration routes, seasonal resources, and predator behavior had a decisive advantage. Intelligence, in its earliest functional forms, became an evolutionary force. The environment reinforced these trends. Resources were no longer evenly distributed. Food appeared in pulses, tied to seasons and climate cycles. Animals that could anticipate these changes thrived. Those that could not were left behind. Life became predictive rather than reactive. This predictive capacity allowed lineages to grow larger without overcommitting. Populations expanded cautiously, stabilizing rather than exploding. Reproduction rates balanced growth with environmental capacity. Extinction still occurred, but it was rarely total ecosystems bent rather than shattered. The ghosts of ancient giants loomed over this process. Evolution had already tested the consequences of unchecked size. Now, natural selection favored designs that avoided those pitfalls. Flexibility mattered. Modularity mattered. The ability to shift diet, behavior, or habitat mattered. This period did not erase the past. It integrated it. Traits forged in ancient seas and swamps were refined rather than discarded. Jaws became more precise. Teeth specialized further. Limbs borrowed structural principles from earlier experiments. Evolution reused what worked, reshaping it to fit a new context. As these systems locked into place, a threshold was crossed. Ecosystems could now support large animals consistently without triggering collapse. The planet had achieved a form of equilibrium that could sustain dominance across geological time rather than brief windows. This threshold explains why what followed appears so sudden in the fossil record. Diversification accelerates when conditions align. Size increases rapidly once support systems are in place. Dominance emerges not because evolution changes speed, but because success becomes sustainable. The rulers that would soon rise did not create this world. They inherited it. And, their power was not accidental. It was the product of millions of years of failure, correction, and refinement carried out by the giants that came before. This chapter represents the final moment before emergence, the silence before motion, the calm before a new age asserts itself. The Earth, reshaped by ancient monsters and mass extinction alike, now possessed the stability to carry giants forward without destroying itself. Everything that came before led here. The giants, before dinosaurs, had already conquered the planet in every possible way. They ruled seas, skies, forests, and swamps. They reached sizes never matched again. They shaped atmospheres and ecosystems through sheer presence, and they paid the price when the world changed. What followed would be different. Dominance would persist longer. Ecosystems would adapt around it rather than collapse beneath it. The next age would not erase the past. It would stand on it. This chapter closes the prelude. The world was ready. The rise that followed did not feel sudden to the planet itself. From Earth's perspective, it was the natural continuation of a process that had been unfolding for hundreds of millions of years. The ground had been prepared, tested, broken, and rebuilt countless times. Every failure of the ancient giants had refined the rules of survival. Now, those rules aligned. The ecosystems that emerged were deeper and more interconnected than at any point in the past. Energy flowed efficiently from plants to herbivores to predators. Waste was recycled quickly. Populations rose and fell in rhythms tied to climate and geography rather than chaos. This stability was not fragile. It was dynamic, capable of absorbing shock without unraveling. For the first time since the distant past, large animals could exist without destabilizing the systems that supported them. This was not because the world had become gentle, but because it had become resilient. The land itself told the story. River systems were permanent rather than temporary scars. Soils were thick and layered, built over long periods of biological activity. Vegetation formed structured communities instead of uniform expanses. Forests, plains, and semi-arid regions coexisted, each supporting specialized life while remaining connected through migration and nutrient cycles. Movement became the defining feature of life in this world. Animals were no longer bound to a single environment. They traveled between habitats as seasons shifted. This mobility reduced local overpopulation and prevented resource exhaustion. It also favored bodies built for efficiency over short-lived dominance. Large size now meant something different than it once had. It no longer implied slowness or excess. It implied control, reach, and endurance. Large animals could travel farther, see farther, and influence larger areas without consuming them into collapse. This subtle difference separated the future rulers from the ancient giants that came before. Predators embodied this change most clearly. They were no longer built solely to overpower. They were built to choose. A failed hunt was no longer just an inconvenience. It was a waste of energy that could threaten survival. Predators that learned restraint thrived. Those that attacked everything did not. This selectivity rippled through ecosystems. Prey animals adapted not just to speed or armor, but to unpredictability. They learned patterns, remembered danger zones, and adjusted behavior based on experience. Survival increasingly depended on awareness rather than reflex alone. These interactions created feedback loops that stabilized ecosystems. When predators grew too effective, prey declined, forcing predators to adapt or move. When prey populations expanded, predators followed, restoring balance. The system regulated itself without catastrophic swings. This self-regulation was the missing element in earlier ages. Ancient giants thrived in environments that lacked these feedback mechanisms. When conditions changed, collapse was inevitable. Now, balance was built into the system. The atmosphere played its role as well. Oxygen levels supported active life without encouraging unchecked growth. Fires occurred, but they reset ecosystems rather than erasing them entirely. Climate variation existed, but it followed patterns life could anticipate and adapt to. Unpredictability remained, but it was no longer absolute. The oceans reflected the same principles. Large marine predators existed, but none monopolized the seas completely. Diversity prevented dominance from becoming brittle. Food webs contained redundancies that allowed recovery after disturbance. Extinction still occurred, but it no longer erased entire evolutionary experiments at once. This era represents the culmination of lessons learned through deep time. Size could return, but only when paired with adaptability. Power could persist, but only when balanced by restraint. Dominance could last, but only when embedded within resilient systems. The giants before dinosaurs were essential to reaching this point. They explored every extreme without understanding the cost. They ruled environments that could not support them forever. Their extinctions were not failures. They were data. Evolution learned from each collapse, refining what worked and discarding what did not. This is why the next age would feel different. It would not be defined by constant resets or fragile dominance. It would be defined by continuity. Lineages would persist for tens of millions of years rather than vanishing abruptly. Ecosystems would evolve gradually rather than collapsing entirely. This continuity allowed complexity to compound, behaviors layered upon behaviors, anatomical refinements built upon previous refinements. Intelligence, sociality, and specialization advanced together rather than in isolation. Life was no longer experimenting blindly, it was iterating deliberately. From a human perspective, this is the point where the familiar world begins to take shape, not in appearance, but in structure. Food webs resembling modern systems, predator-prey dynamics that feel recognizable, landscapes shaped by interaction rather than domination. Yet this world was still alien. The shadows that moved across these lands were not mammals or birds. The sounds were unfamiliar. The rhythms of life followed patterns long gone. But the rules governing survival were finally stable. This chapter marks the true end of the age of ancient giants, not because large creatures vanished, but because gigantism ceased to be reckless. It became integrated into systems capable of sustaining it. Everything that followed would build upon this foundation. The rise of new rulers would no longer be brief flashes of dominance. They would shape the planet for ages. The monsters that came before had carved the path through trial, excess, and extinction. The world that emerged from their legacy was stronger, smarter, and more enduring. And in that world, a new chapter of life was ready to unfold.